Welcome, everybody. Sorry for our first of, I'm sure will be many technological problems. But welcome to tonight's thing. And what we're going to do tonight is we are going to talk about pasture management a little more intensely towards the equine industry than we will in the future classes. And a lot of folks are calling us at the Extension office with concerns, whether they're worried about economic concerns or increased animals on their fields due to folks not taking them for the summer months, or there's a whole host of reasons why folks are concerned, both about their hay supply as well as their ability to maintain the animals that are on their farms for the foreseeable future due to the obvious events that are occurring with COVID-19. So tonight we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about evaluating your pasture, how to evaluate your pasture, a couple of the techniques that we use in Extension to get a little bit more of an accurate view of exactly what's going on in our fields. And then Bill's going to talk a little bit about what to do after we've decided that we're happy with our pastures and what's going on with those. And Hank is also going to talk about what we can realistically expect in terms of yield from our pasture. And we hope that this helps make it a little bit easier to manage our animals on the farm, especially during the summer months and spring when we actually have access to available pasture. We're going to get started. So first I want to ask a question. Should a pasture look like this? I wish I could say this was in some of the pastures that I'm managing right now, but in some cases it's not. But do you think our pastures should look like this? We see lots of green grass. We see relatively few animals on a relatively large tract of land. This field here is actually about 5 acres of pasture, and there's only one horse on it. And you can see we've got a really thick, lush growth. Does everybody think our pasture should look something like this? I can't see the view, or do our pastures look like this? As you can see, there's lots and lots of bare spots. There's some spots where it shows obviously overgrazing. On this field here, it's actually a very intensely grazed field, almost to the point of being a dry lot. So we have a really high stocking density on this pasture as well. So this thing's good. So which one is right? Do we want to have that thick, lush pasture on the top with a very low stocking density? Or do we want to have more of a dry lot situation like you see on the picture on the left and on the picture on the bottom? And really, the answer is it just depends on your situation at your farm. You might not want to have a thick, lush green pasture. Maybe you have some animals that gain weight just by looking at hay, which we often talk about our quote unquote easy feeders. Or we might have for a whole host of reasons, we might want to have a really high stocking density on our farm, whether it's economic reasons or we're trying to keep animals off of a really lush pasture. And Carrie is going to talk a little bit about some of these situations in, I think, tomorrow's talks. So we're going to touch on tonight is those of us that have pastures and we're concerned with whether or not we should renovate them or whether or not we should take the effort or if it's a practical exercise for us to try to renovate our pastures. Bill and Hank and myself and Carrie and Mike, we get a ton of calls throughout the growing season about, I'm not real happy with my pastures, and we really want to have a little bit better grazing so we can lower our hay bill, or whether we want our horses to graze, because we all know they're happiest when they're out there grazing. And we always inadvertently ask a ton of questions. What's your stocking density? How many animals do you have on the farm? How long are they out in the pasture? So we go through a whole litany of questions, and they're all really geared towards trying to figure out the optimum stocking density for your operation. Once again, the answer really is, it depends. We always joke around that this is the Extension answer to almost every question. It depends on your situation, but it certainly is true when we're trying to evaluate for grazing and for pasture management. So we're going to talk about in the next probably 15 minutes or so is what I think of the steps to renovation decision making. And when I'm looking at a pasture to make a decision whether or not I want to renovate, I often ask myself two questions. The first one, and probably the most important, is our animal density, or we often call our stocking rate of our livestock per acre when we have available pasture. The other thing I often look at as a crop physiologist is plant density and the stand health. So I want to see if there's enough animals or too many animals to manage the pasture and the growth on that pasture effectively. And I also want to see if the plant density and the stand health is there that can sustain the number of animals that we have on our operation. So real quickly, and my colleagues are going to have to answer this for me because I can't see the screen for people's comments. So we have a 1 acre paddock. You can see the top right picture is our 1 acre paddock. And you can see we have 5 horses in this paddock. Okay, so we have 5 horses on 1 acre of land. We have relatively poor soil. We've made very few amendments to the soil. We haven't really managed effectively our fertility program in the soil. We have absolutely no rotation. These 5 animals are on this 5 acre or 1 acre paddock indefinitely. So we really can't rest or recuperate this paddock. If you look down at the bottom picture, you can kind of see what it looks like when you get up close. You can see lots and lots of bare spots, a couple of weeds that you really can't differentiate, but trust me, there's some weeds out there. So should we renovate this pasture? Yes or no? Is it worth our time and energy to do so? Lucia says yes. Melissa says probably won't last. I'm actually getting some answers up here. Elizabeth says yes. Okay. Well, I would argue in this situation that we really shouldn't spend our resources trying to renovate this pasture. And it really boils down to the reason why we have such poor growth in this pasture is we just simply have too much of a stocking density here. There's really too many animals on this 1 acre paddock to justify continuing to spend money and resources on trying to renovate. So animal density is rarely considered in renovation decisions. And countless phone calls we get where we're trying to improve our pasture. And when we start asking the question about stocking density, we really do just have too many horses in this situation to manage. It's also perhaps the most important criteria for decision making. And honestly, in some instances, the biology of the field, or really when we're talking about pasture growth, we're talking about the crop physiology, makes a successful renovation impossible. And we're going to talk a little bit about ways that we can evaluate our pasture and our operations to see if we can make the decisions whether or not to renovate. So there's a couple of rules of thumb, and with every rule of thumb, you know, there's certainly the exceptions to the rule. But in generally speaking, horses need 1 to 2% of their daily diet as forage. So for a 1,000-pound horse, 10 to 20 pounds a day for forage. Generally speaking, we think about 1 to 3 acres of pasture per horse. 3 might be getting a little on the heavy side when we're thinking about lush growth of pasture. And the animal density actually depends on the turnout time. So we have a 1/2 acre per horse. We're looking at, generally speaking, 3 hours per day of grazing time. And you could read through it all the way up to greater than 2 acres. We can generally consider that it's pretty good for unlimited turnout during the season when the pastures are actively growing. Like I said before, animal density is certainly a rule of thumb when we're talking about these numbers. And that density can be higher or lower depending on several factors. And I listed a couple here. The grazing habits. We all know that horse that just goes out there and mows down until you bring them back in. And we have other animals that go out there and just kind of stand around and wait to come back in and get their grain. So we have differences in our horses, obviously. The types of grasses that grow. We generally look at planting cool season grasses when we're in the Northeast. Carrie and Hank and Bill and myself were actually looking at some of the warm season grasses for pasture as a research project this summer, but we'll continue that in the future. Also, the pasture health is really an important consideration. If we start with a thick, lush growing pasture that's has the adequate fertility, we might be able to be a little bit more aggressive in our pasture management schemes. Rotation is another one, and we're going to talk about rotation a lot in the next coming nights. Being able to let your pasture rest and recuperate is really critical when we're thinking about managing for the maximum number of animals on that acre. And another one is supplemental feed. Some folks rely heavily on just pasture and grasses with minimum supplemental feed, while others actually add a little bit more supplemental feed. And again, Carrie's going to talk about that in the next classes. But these all go into exactly how much grazing is going to go on while the animals are out in your pasture. I told you before I was a crop physiologist, so I had to put up some crop physiology slides. If you look over to the left, this is what we typically would consider our grasses response to really heavy, really aggressive, frankly, overgrazing of our pasture. And you could see the very, relatively speaking to the other grasses as we move further to the right, a poor root system. A lot of our grasses store a lot of their energy right at the soil root line and in the roots. And as we really aggressively mow down through grazing the grass, the sparse stand makes it very hard for the grasses to store their reserves through the winter months. And the center one is a little bit more of a not perfectly managed, but a little bit better managed. You can see a little bit better growth, a little bit higher grazing height. And finally, the one all the way to the right is where we're managing very aggressively our grazing schemes. And you can see the root zone is much more thick, has the ability to scavenge through the soil to find some of the nutrients that it might need, has a much better stand and a much better surface of grass. So this is how grasses respond when we manage. And that's why we're paying so much attention to managing our rotations and our grazing pressure. So plant density is another very important characteristic when we're thinking about whether or not to renovate our pastures. And it's important to know that generally speaking, pastures are often overgrazed. And you can see this picture in the background. You can see some weed pressure. You can see lots of bare spot. You see very little grass. And this is generally a response to overgrazing and grazing pressure. We're not going to talk a whole lot about it tonight, but the species of grass also has a lot to do with this. Some of our grasses that we really enjoy having in our pastures just really don't respond very well to grazing pressure. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, which we're not going to get into tonight. But understanding what species we're actually putting into our pasture is also a very important consideration. So overgrazing leads to several things. Poor stands, as you can see in the background of this picture, increased weed pressure. Every time we have a space that's open where the grass isn't growing and actively competing, you have the ability for some of our competitive weeds to come in. And what we really want to do is we want to evaluate each pasture before we make a decision. And you might ask how we do this, and we're going to go through two methods that we use to evaluate pastures right now. So when we evaluate a pasture stand from the extension perspective, what we really want to do is we want to determine the percentage of what we consider to be our desirable forage. Again, there's a whole host of forage species that we might want in our pastures, and those are up to you in a lot of regard. Generally speaking, we're talking about cool season grasses. And we also want to be able to identify the weeds. We talk an awful lot about weeds that are toxic, especially when we're thinking about animals like horses and sheep and some of the other ones that we really have considerations for toxic weeds. So we really want to be able to identify them. I'm going to show you a few resources in just a minute. So the two methods that we use mostly are what we consider to be the square method, as you can see on the top right picture. And one that we really like using and we really promote an awful lot is the string intercept method, which you can see on the bottom right picture. And we're going to go over these real quickly now. The first one is a square method. Now we use the square method an awful lot when we're doing a lot of our research when we're concerned with the actual yield of our grass species. And basically what you do, and there's a couple of different alternatives to the square method that we use. Some folks just use the square as an area to go out and randomly throw the square we have here is a PVC one that we made for some of our research. And you can just go out there and actually evaluate what's going on within that square and get a general idea going across the field looking. A little bit more academic way that we do it is we actually go into these squares and we actually harvest all the biomass in that square. Okay, so that's how we do an awful lot of our research, where we'll determine yields in pastures or yields in some of our other forage research by actually mowing down an area that we know the area in, and then we convert it to a per acre yield. So square methods are very effective, but they are a little bit more work. And if you're evaluating for your pasture stand and you do it early, you can imagine you have to do an awful lot of them to adequately assess your pasture. One that we really like to use an awful lot here is what we call the string intercept method. And the string intercept method is a quick and accurate method to assess your pasture. Why we really like this method is it requires very minimal tools. And while we do have to do some math, it's not such advanced math that we generally get scared by doing it. So it requires some very basic math, and we're going to go over that in just a few minutes. The equipment that you need, as I already mentioned, is very minimal. You either need a string or a 25-foot tape measure. And we're going to use the example of a 25-foot tape measure throughout the rest of this presentation. You also need a clipboard or a notepad and a pen or pencil to write down what we're seeing as we're going through your pasture. And Hank, if you don't mind, I put down at the bottom of this slide a link to a fact sheet from one of our colleagues on actually using the string intercept method to determine whether or not you want to renovate your pasture. And Hank's going to go ahead and put it into the chat window if you're interested in having access to it. It's also available on our Rutgers Cooperative Extension fact sheet page.
Steve, I don't have it.
Oh, it was on there. I put it in the chat window, the very first chat.
So I can find it. You can keep going. I'll look for it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Carrie. So again, the string intercept method, you can do this method at any time, but generally speaking, we think of this as an early spring assessment. And there's a couple of reasons why. The main reason is it's easier to identify individual grass plants. If you go out there in the middle of the summer and there's 3-foot tall grass, you really have to be able to go through and differentiate what's a grass and what's a weed. So early in the spring is kind of the ideal time to do this. It makes it easier to identify the individual grass plants, as I already said. It makes it easier, certainly, to identify bare areas of soil when you come across them. And probably the most important is it's very early in the spring, and it also allows you to individually identify weeds in your pasture. This is especially important when we're thinking about our concerns for toxic weeds. So all you do with the string intercept method is you, again, select random areas in your pasture. And all you do is you go out and you stretch a tape measure across the surface of your pasture. So what we always tell people to do is, depending on the size, you do them in groups of 2, which makes you have a percentage, which we'll go over in just a minute. But you just pick random places in your pasture. And so you just start walking through the field and stop any place where you feel, but really try to not bias yourself to only going to the good areas of your pasture. It makes an accurate reading really, really difficult to accomplish. So basically all you do is you go out and you stretch the 25-foot of your tape measure. And on that piece of paper and the clipboard, you write down 4 columns. And in each of the columns headers, you put bare soil, desirable forage or grass or whatever terminology you want to use, weeds, and then we really like being able to identify the weed by name. So we want to tell what weed that is when we go through our field, because that helps us determine whether or not we're concerned about toxic weeds or if we want to make some herbicide applications to try to mitigate the weed pressure. Now, we joke around about everybody in Extension gets a cut from the sales of this book. We certainly do not. But the Weeds of the Northeast is a very good resource for identifying a lot of the weeds, and especially weeds that are present in our pasture areas. So this is a really good resource, has great pictures that you can go back to and kind of cross-reference against what you have in your field. So if not this weed, there's several different Extension publications out there that you can look at, especially when we're concerned about toxic weeds. There's lots of good resource for toxic weeds in pasture. So here's an example of the columns. And basically all you're going to do is you're going to walk through, and at every 6-inch mark, you're going to check off whether you see bare soil, the grass, or the desirable forage. And then again, the weeds and the weed species name. Basically the way we do this is we get out there and we walk around through our pasture. It's really that simple, and we stop every so often throughout the field with our tape measure. So again, walk along the tape, stopping at every 6 inches. And if you go for 25 feet, At every 6-inch mark, you record what you see at each stop. And if you go 25 feet every 6 inches, you end up with 50 observations across that 25 foot. And so what we tell you to do is repeat that step. We'll go through and do another random area of 25 feet, stopping every 6 inches, and record what you see, whether a check mark or a tick mark underneath the area that you see, whether you see bare soil or grass cover. And what this does is it gives you 100 total stops. And so all you simply do is you add up each column. And since we've done 100 stops across those columns, the number that you see of tick marks will be the actual percentage that you get across your field. So if you imagine you had 70 stops where you ticked off that you saw grass cover, you would have 70% grass cover in your pasture. And this is as accurate as the number of stops that you do, obviously. So you kind of get a feel for how many you should do across the field. And you certainly want to take into account if you have areas that are much different than the rest of the field when you're doing your evaluations. So after we go through and we use some of these methods to determine our pasture density or our forage density, we have some general rules of thumb that we like to consider on whether or not we should renovate or not. So generally speaking, what we think of is we have less than 50% of our desirable forages. We generally think about a complete renovation of that field. Okay, and that could be everything from the lower right where you see a no-till drill where we terminate the field with herbicide and come over with a no-till drill, to some of our more conventional methods such as a brilliant seeder. But we generally would think of less than 50% desirable forages. We really want to go ahead and try to renovate and bring that pasture back to its fullest. Where it gets a little gray is when we get from that 50 to 70% desirable forages. There's a lot of management that we could do in these fields, but generally speaking, we might want to consider overseeding with a desirable pasture to fill in some of those bare spots. And if we get to 70% or more of our desirable forages, we generally think about maintenance. And Bill's going to talk about maintenance now or in just a moment. But when we're talking about maintenance, we're thinking about our fertility programs that we might want to do on our pasture. We're certainly considering rotational grazing in some of our grazing schemes and rotational schemes that we might want to do, especially if we're getting into a heavy or managed amount of animals. And we're certainly considering weed control as our option, especially if we're worried about having some of the toxic weeds within our pasture. So I'm going to end it here with this question. What if I'm satisfied with my pastures? And you can certainly see from this picture that we're probably not very satisfied with this pasture. There's very sparse cover here. But if you are satisfied with your pasture, we're going to switch gears now to talking about some of the management techniques that we can use. I'm going to turn it over to Hank in just a second. Okay, Hank, it's all yours. You should be good.
Okay, now I'm the host. Quarter. Okay, can you see my screen, Steve?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So like I said before, my name is Hank McNell. And I work for Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Warren County. I'm a senior program coordinator. And tonight, I will be talking about soil sampling and expected yields. I have an animal science educational background. So going into this, most of my experience is working with beef producers and some sheep and goat. So my degree is in animal science from North Carolina State University, and I obtained my master's degree in endocrinology and animal biosciences from Rutgers. And I previously worked as a livestock educator for Cornell Cooperative Extension, working with the large and small ruminant producers. So tonight I'll be discussing the importance of soil testing, how to implement it, and what to be looking for expected yields for your pasture. So first off, what is a soil test and why is it important for your pastures? A soil test is a process by which elements are chemically removed from the soil and measured for their plant available content within the sample. So what we're looking for, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sodium, sulfur, manganese, copper, and zinc. And the quantity of available nutrients in the sample determines the amount of fertilizer that is going to be recommended. So a soil test also measures your soil pH and the humic matter and exchangeable acidity. These analysis indicate whether lime is needed and so how much you need to apply. So soil testing is important because, for one, it's economically prudent. The appropriate application of nutrients and or lime can save you money. You don't want to buy nutrients that your soil doesn't need. So instead of doing that, you want to invest in what you have, so that you're going to bring your pasture will bring you healthy growth for your yields of your fields. You will be provided with adequate recommendations to apply optimal levels of nutrients or lime to your soil. So it's necessary to know the existing pH and the availability of essential plant nutrients in the soil. So if you have too much or too little of these nutrients or limestone, it can be harmful to your plant growth. And then lastly, it's environmentally responsible. So soil testing is a responsible practice. Applying fertilizer or other nutrient sources incorrectly can lead to nitrate or phosphorus contamination to your water resources. So by applying fertilizer appropriately, you can ensure that you're feeding your plants in an environmentally friendly way. So soil sample instructions. Typically, I get a bunch of calls just like Steve had mentioned before, asking questions for pasture advice. And typically I get, how do I obtain a soil sample? And the follow-up question is, how many tests should I take? So at Rutgers, we have the soil testing lab, and they have a lot of information and their website on the bottom of this slide, so you can go and get more information. But essentially, areas that are different in appearance, slope, drainage, soil type, and then past cropping should be sampled and tested separately. You also want to sample separately areas that have received different treatments. So if you treated with lime or fertilizer previously. And then to obtain a representative sample, you want to plan to collect about between 12 and 16 subsamples within the field. The subsamples will be combined and mixed to create your representative sample. So the soil is easier to get wet. Oops, sorry. The soil is easier to sample when the moisture condition is suitable for plowing. So you want to use a tool, a trowel or your spade or an auger, something that you will be able to obtain a thin vertical slice from your cores of the sample from the surface. And you want to go between 6 to 8 inches down into the soil. And if you're using a trowel or a spade, you want to insert the blade into the soil to a depth of about 6 to 7 inches, remove that soil and throw it aside so you can reinsert the blade to take a thin half slice of soil and lift it from the slice from the ground. Using a knife, you can cut the center of the slice an inch wide, core from top to the bottom. You want to place that subsample in a clean bucket or container, and you want to keep on doing this for all of your your location. So between 11 and 15 more locations in that sampling area. You want to place the subsamples together in that container. And if the soil is wet, when you're taking the sample, you want to make sure that you lay it out on a clean paper to air dry. You don't want to heat it up. You just want to make sure that you dry it out. And then you mix the subsamples of sampling area together in the container and break up those large clumps. The goal is to provide a representative sample. And so then you take that sample, you put it in the soil kits that you can purchase from your local extension agent or the local extension office. And we can send it off to Rutgers, or if you have a different soil testing site that you prefer, you can put the soil in a sandwich bag. And then you want to repeat this for as many tests that you need to get tested. And I had mentioned before on the bottom of the slide is the soil testing lab website, but also because of the current times that we are in, they are currently closed, so you can check their website for when they reopen. And if you have any questions, you can call one of us or your local extension agent. So here's an example of what the soil testing result report is going to look like from the Rutgers Soil Testing Lab. This will give you your recommendations for your optimal crop production. The results will also be sent to your local extension office as well. So this is just an example, but the field was in corn production and now wants to switch to hay production. And it's showing you the pH results and your results from the macronutrients and the micronutrients. And then this slide is a nifty resource that I used a lot more when I was working for Cornell Cooperative Extension, but it's very handy. It's the Web Soil Survey. It provides soil data and information produced by the National Cooperative Soil Survey. It's operated by USDA NRCS, and it provides access to the largest natural resource information system, I guess, in the world. NRCS has soil maps and data available online for, I think, more than 95% of the nation's counties. And so I think they're anticipating to have 100% in the near future. But this site is updated and it's maintained online. So you can go to the website, locate your fields, and it will tell you, once you map it out, it'll tell you what type of soil that you have in your pastures or your fields. I have some directions on how to navigate the website. So if it's your first time, it's a little tricky, but if you need help, just send me an email and I can send you the instructions. But once you get the hang of it, it's a pretty nifty tool. So going over all of the soil testing or how to conduct a soil test is important because essentially all of these things that Steve was talking about and testing your soil fits into the big puzzle of getting your yields for your pasture. So during the third webinar of the series, Dr. Westendorf is going to go into more details about forages and its nutritional components and the importance for livestock nutrition. And we will also go over get into more detail on grazing systems. But for this presentation, you can see, depending on plant species or your mix, soil health, fertility, and then the grazing method will determine the forage yield in tons per acre per year. So when I showed this slide to Steve before, and he saw the 7 tons under the orchard grass, he did a double take. But that's with your management intensive grazing. And so we will go over those grazing systems more in depth next Monday. But this is it's a good chart that was established from Penn State, and this is important because when trying to determine what you will be feeding your animals nutritionally and financially, what you can feed them in the pasture and what will be needed for supplementation. So again, what Steve was talking about, it all depends on what your plan is for your pasture, your own personal goal. And this all ties back to the importance of your soils and why they should be tested. Another thing to consider is just because you can get a higher yield with an intensive management strategy with a particular species of grass, it might not match up to the nutritional needs of your livestock depending on the stage of production that they're in. And I can send out the slides and the chart after the presentation. But then again, this is another chart from Penn State. These charts show other grazing systems, and depending on your soil management, what your forage yields will be by the tons per acre per year. As you can see, the drop in yield based off of a less intensive management grazing system, and the yields are even less when the soils are an important issue. Like I said before, there are many pieces to this puzzle, so which will take time and strategy to get right. That's why we're here. And I think that's it. Yeah, so here's my contact information. If you have any questions for me that you think of later, feel free to reach out. I'm gonna switch off to still.
And there we go. Okay, let me get this all set here. Okay, one of the things I wanted to share with everybody is we're going to start talking. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the agronomics and the production end of it. This is our website that we have for the experimentation for cooperative extension. One of the things you want to see that there in the lower right hand, I circled in yellow. That is actually our publication section, and there's a lot of publications on pasture management that you can get access to. We have detailing what Steve had talked about for evaluating your pasture. There's information on establishing your pasture, managing your pasture, fertility for your pasture. So if you haven't checked it out, I would check out that section of our website. One thing I figured we could start with is, I don't know if you can see what we have here, but what does your pasture share with all these different pictures? You're probably saying nothing, or maybe if you manage your pasture, you're saying, when the answer that I've come up with is that your pasture is a crop, and you've got to look at it that way. You are actually trying to produce forage off of your pasture. So there's going to take some maintenance, some management to get your pasture to the full productivity. If you plant it and walk away, you're going to have a lot of problems with it. And that's actually one of the more common things that I've encountered. I've been with Rutgers going on 25 years now doing forage and pasture visits. And one of the common things that we find for most people is that they'll tell me they don't lime. They've never fertilized, never taken a soil test. So these are all things you have to take into mind when you're trying to manage your pasture. Steve kind of mentioned this already. Should a pasture look like this? Well, I guess we would all like our pasture to look like this. There's a lot of considerations that come in to get your pasture to look like this. We've already talked about some of them: stocking density, whether you're using rotational grazing. But it's not something you're just going to plant it and it's going to look like that. It's going to take a little bit of work along the way to get your pasture to look like this. Again, and I always tease about this. I don't know if anybody's ever realized this, but this was way back when on campus, what our pastures looked like before we did a lot of the renovations we had done with the Riders Lane facility. But you can see that pasture or forage management wasn't our primary concern when you look at this photo. Is this possible? Okay. Yes, this is possible. Is this real world? Well, I guess I could argue with a yes or no. This is a little bit of a staged photo. there's been no horses or no animals put on this pasture prior to me taking this picture. But it took a lot of work to be able to get the forage to that. And it's something that you can do or you can strive to do. All right, so what are the benefits of a good pasture? Well, if you think about it, it's feed. Hank just talked about the potential yield that you can get off of it. And so I know right now I've had quite a few calls. Hay for some farms is a little bit in short supply right now. We're waiting for the harvest to come in for some more hay. Others have mentioned that they're having trouble getting the resources together to feed their horses or livestock due to outside jobs that have been lost with the current situation. So if you manage your forage, hey, you got to look at it. Hey, it's possible feed that I can use. Your pasture can also supply protein, vitamins, minerals, soil and water conservation. We're all concerned about being environmental stewards, and we're talking about protecting water quality. If you have plants growing on the soil and they're in good shape, they're keeping the soil there. It's not washing in the streams, potentially causing problems with algae, fish kills, things like that. Pastures are also an exercise area for the horses, and they provide an aesthetic value to us. So what's a good pasture? Well, tight, smooth sod. So how can I get that? Number one, that's going to come into selecting the right species. If you ever notice that bluegrass is a big component of a lot of pastures, the reason we put that in your pasture is because it's a tight sod forming grass, and it kind of weaves in between the bunch grasses that we put. You ever put orchard grass in your pasture? That's a bunch grass. So we try to combine the mixture of grasses that are in your pasture mix to meet the needs that we need. A little bit on the pasture mix is simpler is better. It's a lot easier to manage. When we start getting too many different grasses in the mix, a lot of people will talk to me about Timothy. Timothy is not a good choice for pastures because Timothy has a growing point that's pretty much at or near the surface. And when horses graze it, they damage it and it will thin out a little bit. So you got to pay attention to what's in that pasture mix. The other thing we don't want is poisonous plants. Everybody says that a horse will actually use instinct. I can tell you there's been examples where instinct hasn't necessarily worked. Safe fences, that's another component that we want, right? We don't want any damage we don't want horses to get injured or anything like that from having unsafe fences. We want a large area for exercise and ample shade and water. There's shade out there. So that's if I was picking my ideal pasture, what I would be looking for. Okay, so this is the most common one. How do I get a poor pasture? And unfortunately, this is what we actually see more of, those of us working in extension. We usually get called out to the poor pastures. We don't get called out a lot to the really lush, healthy pastures. And the number one problem we'll see with the poor pastures is overgrazing. Okay, so, and a lot of that comes to stocking density. You may not have enough land, but it's a balancing act at this point. Can I manage my grazing so that I can get forage production without harming the grasses? And a lot of times it's the two they don't mesh very well. Sometimes if you have too many horses, you're just not going to get that lush pasture. Once in a while we'll see undergrazing, though not commonly. That's basically something we can take care of with mowing or maybe even harvesting for hay. Hank talked about soil fertility a little bit. That's one of the bigger problems we've seen. And I've actually seen more pastures that have turned around with a soil test and some lime and fertilizer. That will encourage growth of the desirable forages that we have. Okay, the other thing is, as I said, is overpopulation, having too many animals on the space you have. Did you pick the right species? Your species selection goes a long way. Like I mentioned before, if you plant Timothy, you're going to expect a poor pasture. Timothy is not a grazing grass. It's really for hay production. Is your soil, when you look at the soils, are your soils well drained? Are they poorly drained? We have a couple of fact sheets on species selection, which matches, the grazing that you're looking for with the soil conditions. So make sure you're picking the correct species. The other thing we'll see is no weed control. And then you really got to step back and ask, why am I getting weeds? It's probably because we're overgrazing or we're not managing correctly. The weeds are pretty opportunistic, and they have a tendency to come in poorly managed pastures. And the other thing is letting nature take its course. Like I said before, if you plant it, you have to maintain it. If you don't maintain it, then you're going to end up having a failure. Okay, this is a diagram of something I like to call the pasture triangle. And we have to have all three of these in balance to be able to get a good pasture. Number one at the top is the species selection. Am I picking good cool season grasses? Am I blending possibly a legume? If you start to put a legume in there, like a clover or something like that, it becomes a little bit more complicated for managing. An all grass pasture is actually easier to manage than a mixed pasture. So make sure you're balancing or you're picking the right species to the area. Look at your site conditions. Is it poorly drained? Is it on a slope? Is it things like that come into play when I'm trying to establish these pastures. If I have poor drainage, that's going to become a problem, and there's certain species I'm definitely not going to pick for that. And the other side of this triangle is your management. Okay, am I going out there and taking a soil test every 3 years? Am I going out and clipping ungrazed grasses that are getting stemmy? Am I encouraging new growth? Am I practicing weed control? Am I putting lime down? All these things are going to come into play if you're looking for that really nice pasture. Planning, okay? So it's like I said before, you have to actually do a little bit of work with these. And when you're laying out, if you're establishing new pastures, look at what your present resources are. And a lot of times this actually comes into play when I'm putting in gates and things like that. Is my gate wide enough that a lime truck can get in there? A lot of people, if they'll decide maybe they want to do it on their own, and then they figure, wow, 5 acres, that's a lot of pushing with a hand spreader. Or do I even have a spreader? Do I have a tractor? So it can accomplish some of these things that need to be done. These are all considerations that you should take into play when you're doing this. What kind of acreage do you have available for your pasture? A larger acreage or splitting your acreage into different units actually helps you with your grazing management plan. So if you're very tight, if I have 5 horses and 3 acres, you're going to be challenged when you're trying to get your pasture started. And if you're starting something new, if you buy a new property or something, a lot of times people will buy farm properties I've been involved with. What was your previous crop history? And the reason I'm asking you that is if you're trying to establish something, there could be carryover from a corn herbicide or a soybean herbicide when you're immediately trying to establish a new pasture. So keep that in mind. What's your carrying capacity? Rule of thumb that we use is 1 horse per acre. There have been studies where you can do intensive grazing management. You can get higher numbers with that. But if I'm just looking for what's my guideline, that's what I'm ideally shooting for. Am I going to divide my pasture into management units? All the time I'll talk to people who have 1 very large pasture and they didn't split it into 2 units. So what's the advantage of splitting it into 2 units? If I split it into 2 units, I can shut one side down. If I want to do a fertilizer application or I want to do a new seeding and I want to try to keep horses off it for a while. So think about splitting whatever acreage you have into different management units. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about grazing management in the future, but sacrifice lots come into play here. Do I have a sacrifice lot so that I can effectively manage my other pasture units? The other thing to ask yourself are, what are your goals? If you have a lot of animal units on a small acreage, am I just looking for a turnout area? Am I looking for exercise? Am I looking for forage production? These are all questions you want to ask yourself before you get into managing your pasture. All right, there's a couple of questions I saw in the chat box about what mixes or what do I pick. When we talk about forages, we'll break them into cool season grasses, which where we live in the Northeast, that's primarily what we're going to be growing. There's warm season grasses, Bermuda grass, switchgrass, big blue stem. Those are typically southern grasses. And then we have legumes that we can pick in our mix, alfalfa, white clover. There's different selections there. you want to pick a good balance when you're trying to come up with your mix. We do have the fact sheets on species selection, but predominantly, in fact, pretty much in our area, cool season grasses are the grasses that you're going to have to choose from. So let's look a little bit about cool season grasses. If I'm looking at my cool season grasses, you can see the grass here with the line where I have the dash line here where I get a lot of growth in the spring. Summer, they start to tail off a little bit and they come back in the fall. Okay, so that's when you're getting your peak forage production. And that's why your pastures slow down in the summer months. We get the hot, dry conditions. The grass isn't growing that well until we get the cooler conditions in the fall. So that's pretty much what we're going to have. Our trick is maybe to try to balance something and see if we can get something in the summer. There's not really a lot of options for that. As you can see, we'll get some legumes in there. But be careful. When you start mixing legumes with your grasses, it becomes a little bit more complicated in terms of management. Then we could also have other issues like slobbers with slaframine. So those are some issues that you may not want to deal with. But those are some of the options that you have. But just recognize we are a part of the country where cool season grasses are what we really have for our pastures. So let's talk about how we're going to manage that pasture. We're looking at, I just saw a question pop up about warm season. Can you mix them in? Warm season grasses are difficult to establish. They don't do really well in our area. I've had switchgrass I've used, but they're very difficult to establish. They take a couple of years to establish. It's not really very successful in our area. So if we're going to manage the pasture, remember it takes year-round attention. There are certain weeds which are winter annuals, there are summer annuals. They're going to take attention at different times. The other thing you have to remember is I'm doing my sampling my soils. Does my soil test come back and say I need lime? Well, the one thing about lime is the saying we often use is lime takes time. And if I'm doing a liming, I have to usually, if it's really bad, have to take about 6 months to get the full benefit of a liming application. So these are things you want to keep in mind. The other thing you can do, especially on a new seeding, or one of the things if you want to try to delay early grazing, and Steve showed you the root systems before, you want to get roots a chance to get established and vigorous. So if I can delay early grazing or not be vigorous in my early grazing, it goes a long way to helping establish those forages that are in there. The other thing is Hank talked about soil testing. Unfortunately, the lab is shut down right now. But if you are in a project that you're trying to work on right now, the rule of thumb we use in the absence of a soil test is to assume that you're within the medium fertility range. So you would try to base your fertilizing on that. I would definitely look at that fact sheet that we have on horse pasture fertilization. I think it's bulletin 312. You want to make sure you look at that. We'll give you the recommended fertilizing. Also, again, like I mentioned in the beginning, you got to treat this like it's a crop. Okay, so what do we do with our crops? We fertilize them. Everybody is good at fertilizing their lawns, but unfortunately, a lot of people aren't good at fertilizing their pastures. They're going to have to be fed, especially with nitrogen. You want to try to fertilize annually. In my area, I'm in the southern half of the state. We try to fertilize twice a year. In the spring, we'll put a little bit down before grazing season really begins. And then we will also try to get a fall after the grazing season. Why do we do fall fertilizing? To help build the roots and get the plant to be able to be vigorous through the winter months. And here's the bulletin I was talking about. It's bulletin 312, nutrient management for horse pastures. It has a lot of good information on the fertility. On how you want to manage your pastures. It talks about the phosphorus levels, manganese levels, pH. If you haven't seen this bulletin, I would definitely download myself a copy. Here it is, the soil test, right? That's one of the keys for managing the pasture. A lot of people are expecting when they hear a soil test kit, they're thinking, little beakers and things like that. All it is really an envelope, and in that envelope, there's a questionnaire. Make sure you answer those questions in there on how you're managing your pasture, what you're looking for in terms of recommendation. Is it a new seeding? Is it for maintenance? Spend the time filling that out. What we usually tell the students is garbage in equals garbage out. So make sure that you spend the time so you're not sending us, you're sending us the information we need to give you good recommendations. Hank talked about soil testing. This is one that I've used for quite a while just to show somebody why you should soil test. Let's say you have a 5-acre pasture. All right, right now a soil test goes for $20. We recommend that you sample every 3 years. It comes to $1.33 per acre per year. It's a very minimal investment, but I can give you numerous cases where people have tried to establish pastures with new seedings. You know, they've hired companies to come in and do the seeding, or they bought the seed themselves. They spent considerable amount of money, but they skipped the soil test. And maybe the soil pH was at 5.5 or 5.4. Well, the grass came up, it was a little bit green, then it turned yellow and then died. And for that cost of $1.33 per acre per year, they could have avoided that situation. You can't even go to the convenience store, you know, Quick Check or Wawa, get a cup of coffee for $1.33. It's a small investment, but one I would not skip when I'm trying to manage my pastures. All right, so how are we managed from the soils perspective for our forages? We're going to get that soil test done, right? We're going to correct any deficiencies that we have. And then your whole goal is, I know it's a little bit painful usually at first if you haven't managed the fertility, that you're going to come and you're going to say to us, boy, it takes so much fertilizer. You can meter it or you can put it in small doses, but our goal is to maintain the optimum fertility. Once you get the fertility levels to that optimum range, then we're really talking maintenance applications. Okay. And putting down that lime or that fertilizer, that's probably going to turn things around more than anything else that you're going to do when you're out there. Get that test done. And a lot of people will lime by the calendar. I don't know how many people will say, "Up, it's fall, it's time to lime." Well, you really may not need to lime just every fall. It might be every 3 years. And you actually might be spending money that you don't need to. Without a soil test, you won't know. And as I said before, we split that fertilizer application into 2 applications. All right, so why do we talk about pH and why do we worry about fertility with the forage grasses? This is a chart that shows you actually the availability of the various nutrients. And if you look at between that 6 to 7, which is where we typically recommend, all those bands that are across there are at their widest, which means the nutrients are available to that forage grass. If you look at some of the ones, if you look at like magnesium, when I get below 5 or there, the bands really start to get narrow. Our whole goal is to keep our pH between 6 to 7. That's not a number that we just picked. That's because of the availability of the nutrients that are there. Manage your grazing, okay? This is a big one. We're trying to manage your pastures. Overgrazing is the most common problem we see across the state. If you get that grass down to below about 3 inches or so, you're really damaging that grass plant. You're making that plant use the reserves that are in the roots and become stressed. Undergrazing can happen. I don't see it too often. Typically, it's when there's not enough horses or enough livestock on the pasture. And what ends up happening is the forage gets stemmy and coarse, and you really want to cut it and get rid of it at that time. The other thing to look at is rotational grazing. That's where you're going to get your maximum benefit and your maximum forage production. Here, if you look here, so that's a chart that Steve put. But look at the below ground portion there. That portion that's below ground, that's the energy reserve for your plant to be able to produce the nutrients or forage. So what we want is a lush, dense root system. When I get the overgrazing, I don't have a lot of roots down below. And if I don't have those roots, I'm not going to get the forage production. The grass is going to thin. And then what do you think happens? With thinning grass, the weeds come in. And then you're going to start complaining to us, I have so many weeds in my grass. All right, let's look at pasture management. Why consider rotational grazing? Well, if we start to look at it, it makes your whole overall pasture management actually easier. It gives you a great deal of flexibility. You can actually perform certain practices one section while you have another section closed down. I'm able to increase my stocking density. So that's one of the things you want to look at is looking at rotational grazing. And you're going to get increased forage production because you're not stressing the plant as much. Here's a quick look at a rotational grazing scheme. Again, when I'm looking at this, one component of it also is the sacrifice area. If you have that sacrifice area, that's an area we know we're not going to get maximum production out of. And without the maximum production, we can kind of use that as an area where, hey, I'm going to dedicate this to not a lot of forage production there. But you see, we've got areas that are resting, areas that are to be grazed. I've got a lot of flexibility when I can go in and mow certain areas, when I can put fertilizer treatments down and still have an area to be grazed. So one of the things you want to do is think about, again, this is an ideal situation in this diagram. Even if I had 2 grazing areas, I've actually increased my management potential and made it a lot easier on myself. Mowing and clipping. And if I look at this, there's a couple of reasons I like mowing and clipping. One of the things I like mowing and clipping is weed. If I'm trying to keep weeds under control, what I'm doing is I'm cutting seed heads off. So hopefully I'm not going to, or flowers, so I'm not going to get seed production to help manage my weeds. I'm also going to encourage new growth of new forage. I'm going to get rid of that old stemmy material. By mowing it, I'm going to encourage new growth. So it's really one of the management techniques. If you can't do anything other than your soil test, put a little bit of lime and fertilizer and mowing, you're going to end up increasing your potential for more forage on your pasture. All right, so why am I going to clip? If I'm on the horse side of things, think about it. Wow, you know how horses graze. They're spot grazers, right? They leave certain areas they don't touch. So if I go out there and I end up mowing the stemmer areas, the stemmier areas, I'm gonna end up increasing forage production. That coarse forage is unpalatable, so I'm actually encouraging that new vegetative growth. Big thing too with the clipping is for weed control. It's one of your weed control strategies that you're going to use quite a bit. Again, don't scalp it. One of the things is keep the height no more lower than about 3 inches. If you start to mow too low, just as bad as overgrazing, and you're going to actually damage the grasses a little bit, and you're going to put those grasses under stress. Weed control, that's one of the big things too. It's one of the best defenses you can get to get a healthy stand of forage. But weed control is usually the problem. The reason you're having problems with weeds is really if your pasture management, you're not managing your pasture so the weeds are able to come in. If I'm fertilizing, cutting, and rotating, I'm actually going to have healthy grass, and by encouraging that healthy grass, I'm going to end up outcompeting the weeds. The other thing you want to know, Steve kind of took at the book there, the Weeds of the Northeast. On the weeds of the Northeast, that actually you want to know, use that as a tool as to what weeds I have out there, because that's going to help you come up with a strategy for weed management. You know, we have summer annuals, we have winter annuals, we have perennials. Knowing what weeds are out there is really key to how I'm going to go about and manage it. And if you're going to use chemical control, it's an option that you can use, is make sure you read and follow all the label directions. We do a whole series of talks just on weed management. I do a series of talks on poisonous plant management, but knowing what you're doing and how to manage them and what species you're dealing with is key. Does anybody know what that weed is? Well, if you don't know, sometimes it gets confused with wild garlic or wild onion. That's actually Star of Bethlehem, which is actually can be a toxic weed. It has a white stripe on there. It used to be an ornamental years ago. It's escaped, and I have seen several pastures across the state that have it in. But that's one of those weeds. It's important to know what's growing out there, because a mistake can actually be deadly if you don't know what we're talking about. Poisonous plants can be a concern when we're managing it. Make sure we know what the species are that are out there. Don't rely on instinct solely. Everybody can tell me a story about a curious horse. I've had a couple of horses where they've actually succumbed to poisonous weeds. They were surprised. There's a whole host of things. We have a fact sheet on poisonous weeds, species of concern. Take a look at that one too. A lot of times when we're going to have the problem too is during periods of drought, because unfortunately the weeds tend to be the lush green growth that you'll see out in the pasture. Make sure your horses are well fed. They have supplemental forage available to them during periods of drought. But learn to recognize what are the poisonous plants that can be a problem. All right, here's one. This goes back probably 15 years or more ago. It was actually, I was in Camden County. Does this look like a healthy pasture to you? Well, looking at a distance, to most people, it does. You know, it's lush green growth. They'd be happy with it. Maybe you'd say it's grazed a little too much. This actually had quite a few horses that were actually grazing on this. But this was actually in those pastures. It was actually one of the predominant species that are out there. I don't know if anybody knows what this is. This is false dandelion. It's actually a species that can cause some problems. We were working with New Bolton Center. They got called out, a couple of the horses. Here's another picture of the flower, the false dandelion. There's a condition which you may be familiar with called string halt. Like grazing on the false dandelion. It's also called sometimes cat's ear. That causes the condition of string halt. So that sometimes looks can be deceiving, and that's why you really want to know what's out there in your pastures. Another question that comes up a little bit is, why didn't the previous stand persist? I put all that money in the seed. I overseeded. I went out there. You know, maybe you didn't rake it in. You just flung seed in the air, right? You put it down there. You expected the forage to establish. Well, these are the questions you probably want to ask yourself. Did I have poor fertility? And the question I'm going to ask you is, when's the last time you had a soil test? Okay. And a lot of times you guys will stare at your shoes because, they think that I'm calling them out on something, but that's one of the tools that you need to know. And you can't tell if you have poor soil fertility just by looking at the pasture. The other question to ask is, are you overgrazing? Did I pick the wrong forages for the region and the soil conditions? How many times do people go and buy a pasture mix? If you ever notice, the pasture mixes have about a dozen or more species in them. Well, those are designed by the companies to basically be able to go from Vermont all the way down into Virginia or more. They put a little bit of everything in there. Hopefully, you're going to get some sort of growth. There are probably way too many forages in there. Go to our fact sheet on species selection. Typically, a lot of the forages that we'll recommend for a pasture, there's only 3 or 4 of them in your mix. So if you ask you these questions and you say, boy, I never really thought about these, you're kind of wasting your time if you're trying to manage your forages. These are actually the backbone or the key that you need to know, need to address. Steve talked about pasture renovation. And the reason I put this up here is pasture renovation is not always, taking a plow to the ground, working the soil. There's a lot of things that go into pasture renovation. Am I resting the pasture? Am I fertilizing? Am I liming it? Am I clipping it? Am I practicing rotational grazing? All these can be components of pasture renovation. So think about that. Just because we're telling you to renovate a pasture doesn't mean that we're automatically telling you that you have to go in there and take a plow to it. Steve gave you the guidelines for the percent cover. There's tools and techniques we could use based on what's there for desirable forage. And that is all that I have, guys. I think I probably went over.
That's great. I just want to point out one question that I don't feel comfortable answering. Sandy asked, what about moss and pastures?
Moss,
what do you do about it?
Yeah, moss is usually a condition of moisture conditions, shading, and it could also be the pH that you have. First thing we would probably look at is, let's rule out pH and let's look at, whether it's too shady. Is it a drainage issue? Maybe we have to pick different species to match the area with. We'll see it a lot. I get a lot of homeowners, believe it or not, even on home lawns, who have problems with moss. I guess I can turn it back to you, Hank, if you want to talk about what's coming up tomorrow.
While you guys are switching over, does someone want to answer if there's a seed company that you would recommend for purchasing in New Jersey, in your area? So I'm not sure what area.
You want to talk about Steve? We're not really supposed to recommend a company.
Yeah, as a general rule, we do not recommend specific companies. but I would certainly look to some of the species, the forage species that we recommend for your pasture. I'm sorry, we're just really not supposed to do that.
Yeah, one of the things you can look at is like the companies, like the larger companies like Pioneer Seed, Barenberg. A lot of the dealers work with those groups. You could see maybe about having a mix of just the species that you want. You could talk to one of the ag suppliers and say, I don't want to make the impression that all of those pasture mixes are definitely bad. It's just you're getting a lot of stuff in there that you may not need. It would be simpler to get something, balanced. Like one of the ones that comes up a lot is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Tikapoo orchard grass. That's actually a grazing type orchard grass, which grows a little bit more laterally. If I was planting a pasture, I would probably try to see if I could get Tikapoo in there compared to some of the other orchard grasses, which are mainly for hay production. Those are some of the little things that if you work with one of your dealers or suppliers, they may be able to work on getting some of those seeds for you.
Yeah, and one more thing to add to what Bill's already said is some of our grasses have different growth periods. So we have some that are what we consider to be a later maturing type of grass. So picking the right mixture of grass species in your mix is really important as well. And some of the other talks will show you some of the growth curves of some of the major grass species and when they reach maturity. And you can see there's pretty big gaps throughout the growing season. When we talk about cool season grass species, they like to grow really well in the early spring, go into sort of a summer slump, if you will, and then come back on really strong again towards the latter part of the summer and early months of the fall. We try to strategize and develop our mixes where we have something to graze during those warmer seasons or during those warmer months.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the questions in the chat too. One of the things, like the question came up about with the soil testing labs not open. If you're going to lime and fertilize this year, look in that bulletin that we have, that the nutrient management for horse pastures. You could probably safely go with the assumption that your soil is testing in the medium range, and we can adjust, once the lab's back up and running afterwards. But I would at this point just consider that, hey, I'm in the medium testing range if you're doing fertilizing this year.
Yeah, and to build on what Bill had already said, we generally say that we recommend soil sampling in the fall, and it's for a whole host of reasons that we won't get into. But we really can't make dramatic changes in our soil pH in the next couple of months anyway. So you could assume what Bill had already said, take a soil sample in the fall, and then make your adjustments to your pH if you need to in the fall. And you could certainly make adjustments in, in the phosphorus and potassium levels. And just a general kind of rule of thumb for you to think about, grasses are really big consumers of nitrogen and they're really big consumers of potassium. They don't really use an awful lot of phosphorus in their growth and development. So we kind of focus on a lot, the nitrogen as a, generally speaking, our limiting nutrient, and then potassium as well.
Yeah, and if you're in the southern half of the state where we have sandier soil, potassium really plays a bigger role because we don't have the cation exchange capacity to be able to store any sort of potassium in the soil. So that's really key, is making sure you're putting potassium down in the south.
Bill, I see a question, and Hank, I see a question from Christy about poor soil for pasture grazing mix for beef cows and what would we recommend. Christy, the one thing I would definitely say is we want to evaluate what exactly you mean by poor soil conditions. If it's a nutritional deficiency, or if it's your soil pH, we would really want to see a soil test result to get an idea of what you mean by poor growing condition. And it also is important if you wanted to incorporate legumes into your mix or not, since you're talking about cattle production. Hank, do you have anything else to add to that?
I'm sorry, I was muted. No, I think that's good, having a sort like, the clover mix in there. I think with beef cows, though, I've seen pastures with, a variety of mixes Essentially, if one's not growing, something else will, and the cows will eat it. It's not as it's different than horses.
Yeah, one of the other problems we'll see sometimes is soil drainage comes into play a little bit. A lot of times, especially on the older farms, your pasture ground was not your most productive cropland, so sometimes pastures have a tendency to be in poorer drained areas. So that's where I would probably, the one fact sheet that we wrote actually gives the soil conditions, which most of the grasses do well in. So you might want to try to see if maybe I could switch to, a perennial rye or something like that in the mix.
Yeah, and just to add a point, we in the very beginning of this presentation we had a slide presentation running, and even though we're sort of on a alternative scheduling and telecommuting for the most part, some of our offices are we're certainly available for you to reach out to us, whether it's through email. You can still contact our offices, and some cases our phones are being sent and forwarded to wherever our extension faculty are working. So you can still reach out to us in the traditional means and ask specific questions to your area or to your operation rather.
Yeah, one other caveat which I want to give you on the seed selection before we forget, because I know some people use landscapers. Make sure you are buying forage type grasses, okay? And that really comes into play when we're talking about fescues or things like that. The turf industry has a tendency to put endophytes in, as for insect and disease resistance. From the forage point of view, especially if you're dealing with brood mares or things like that, you want to make sure that you're getting forage type, forages. So just because if you're working with a landscape or something like that, make sure they're aware of that. You want forage or grazing type grasses.
Sweet. All right, I think we're good. So tomorrow, Dr. Williams will be covering 2 topics on horse pasture management, stretching your hay using pasture, and the importance of pasture for horse nutrition. It'll be the same time tomorrow. You should have a different link to get up. And sorry if you had some issues getting in today. I know a couple of people emailed me. We were in the webinar, so hopefully we get the kinks out for tomorrow. But if you have any issues, just send me a message and I'll send you a link tomorrow. You should get an email saying there's a reminder if you signed up for the pasture management for tomorrow. Hey, does anyone else have anything else? Cool. Well, thank you everyone for participating, and thanks to all the panelists and the members of our working group and the specialists at Rutgers. We really appreciate you joining in tonight with us.
See everybody tomorrow. Take care.
Good night, everyone.